Okay, well, welcome everyone to our sixth webinar of our Fundamentals of Restorative Justice series hosted by the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative. As you all know, definitely by now, my name is Aparna Polavarapu. I'm the Executive Director and Founder at SCRJI, as well as an Associate Professor of Law at the University of South Carolina School of Law. So again, I want to remind you of a few items. You will see that you are able to chat with panelists only. Chat is being monitored by Torres, who is ensuring that technology runs smoothly. Other attendees cannot see this chat and the panelists are not reading the chat. If you have questions, please post them to the Q&A, and you can see the icon at the bottom of the screen if you would like the moderator, myself, to see it. South Carolina bar members seeking CLE credit, please keep an eye on the chat. You will be prompted every 15 minutes or so to submit your South Carolina bar number. And you must do this so that we can certify your continued presence in this webinar to the Commission on CLE. We have two ASL interpreters, and we also have live captioning. You should see the interpreter on the side of your screen, and if you can't, please let us know by chat. If you need to access live captioning, please click on the closed caption icon on your Zoom screen. So I'm so excited to be joined today by Mimi Kim, who is a co-founder of Insight, Women, Transgender, and Gender Nonconforming People of Color Against Violence. She's also established Creative Interventions, which you've heard about previously on some of the webinars, and which also worked actively to develop feminist community accountability and transformative justice political frameworks and practices. She's currently working collaboratively on a restorative justice pilot addressing domestic and sexual violence in Contra Costa County, California. So she has experience in both restorative and transformative justice, but she'll be speaking to us today about transformative justice specifically. So just to make sure that we have enough time as possible to hear from you, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mimi, to ask you to talk about your work in transformative justice.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Hello, everybody. Good morning. I'm in California, so it's still a little bit of morning over here. Thank you so much for inviting me, Aparna. Aparna and I actually met very recently in the kind of the wave of webinars that have happened post really Memorial Day, right? This is work, transformative justice and restorative justice is work that many of us have been doing, well, for me, at least for 20 years. But certainly the events of this summer of 2020 have really moved us into a whole different era of thinking about the work we've done in the past, thinking of the politics that we've been developing over time, and thinking about what opportunities we have right now, given that the world has some ways woken up to anti-Black violence, to the absolute urgent need for another world. And obviously also a fight to keep a world that some of us did not benefit from and have not benefited from. So we are in the middle of a turmoil. I know that people are anxious on all sides. And here we are meeting together for an hour and a half in this really amazing series that Aparna has put together. It's not easy, and I really give you kudos, Aparna, to, I know you pulled this together pretty quickly, and we're really successful, I think, in getting, when I looked at the series and all the people, they are a lot of people that I've had in community, but some people that I've fought for years to actually even be able to talk to. So congratulations. And I think that I will do my talk with a lot of respect and in many cases, a lot of collaboration, camaraderie with the people who have been part of this series. Aparna is a new person that I've gotten to know, but I have a sense that we will be in connection and community. And I also know that some people out there in South Carolina had invited me to come out maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago now. So I don't know if you're in this audience, but you may be, or maybe you'll see this in a recording later on. So this is with respect to all of you who have been doing the work, the anti-violence work in South Carolina. I'm really honored to be part of your community for this day. I really had to think a little bit about how I wanted to present what I want to present, and as an opening to more questions and conversation with all of you who I cannot see right now, but who I know are out there. And so I wanted to, I know that you had a whole series of people talk about restorative justice, and that you know that it can mean many different things. I am going to talk more about transformative justice, but it's with an eye to the bridge to some of the work that you've been hearing about and that you may already be thinking about, maybe you're already doing, and hopefully will be doing in South Carolina. The emphasis I want to put in terms of today in transformative justice is our relationship to the criminal legal system. And that part of the trajectory of transformative justice in particular has been in response to the recognition of the long lineage of policing and military as being part of an anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-people of color project that is sometimes seems synonymous with the project of the United States. We also know that the United States holds a kind of an opportunity to challenge this history, rebuild ourselves in response to the history. I think what's really important to know is to be transparent about what that history has been. So I'm not going to do that today, but it is, I'm not going to give it justice today, but I do want to ground the work of transformative justice in some ways by sharing some of the research that I did, but also some of the practice that I've been involved in. I am somebody who comes from a very long, many years of doing work in the anti-violence movement, really since the late 1980s. I was started working in sexual assault at that time in Chicago. At that point, really kind of the reliance on law enforcement was a done deal. I know that I worked in an anti-rape program in Chicago where yes, we did. We definitely, there were survivors who were involved in the criminal legal system by choice, not by choice. It was something that we needed to see, that we needed to advocate for people to get the best kind of treatment from the system as they could. I think we also knew and had experience that most people that we saw when we were working in a sexual assault program didn't want to have anything to do with law enforcement, or when they tried, got very little benefit from that. I know that that is a story that continues. So I came into this work in that way in the late 1980s. I went on to start to work at Asian Women's Shelter, which is a battered women's shelter in San Francisco, where I worked for 10 years. That shelter primarily works with Asian, Pacific Islander immigrant refugees and their families. And during that time that I started working there, that was I started working there in 1991. And in 1994 is when the Violence Against Women Act passed. So I was in the work at that time. I know for many people it's like ancient history, but obviously Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, is a very important part of the anti-violence trajectory and the work that we continue to do today. It is something that it did bring money, resources, benefits to the anti-violence sector or movement. But at the time, I was very aware of the linkages of VAWA to the passage of the crime bill. And I have to say, as somebody who wasn't involved in policy at that time, but knew that people that I knew were doing this work to get VAWA passed, I don't remember exactly how I learned that it actually was part of the crime bill. But when I did, that was one of the moments of change for me, that I was very, very much opposed to the crime bill at the time. I saw that it was a complete travesty against the social justice movement and our movement towards liberation, which I also consider the anti-violence movement to be a part of. And I came to recognize at that time that not only was VAWA passed as part of the crime bill, but I felt like there was a way in which that linkage was disappeared. It wasn't raised. And so I remember being asked to applaud for the passage of VAWA, and no mention was made that the compromise, if we can even call it that, that was made to pass VAWA. And I was appalled, really, not only at the how far our movement had come towards its embrace of, or at least tolerance of, the growth of the carceral system in the United States, but also the lack of transparency about that involvement. So I just remember talking to a very, very few people who felt similarly to me at that time. And I think that was one of those turning points. Not that it was in a complete different direction than I was before, but I think I had and I still continue to feel very tied to the anti-violence movement, but felt that something had gone very, very wrong. And so the work I've done in practice, the work I've done politically, has been really to fully acknowledge the ways in which what we now call carceral feminism had come into play, and to fight against that. So I open my talk with that little story, but also an image that fueled some of my, not only my research, but my politics and my practice, which is this photo from an earlier period of the feminist anti-violence movement in the United States. And you see the sign there that says, jail rapists, not victims. It's a sign you might see right now today, although perhaps with more questions about what that means. We could have looked at that sign and think, yeah, I agree with that. That makes sense. But I want to juxtapose that with we have the image. What does it mean to have a kind of response, and even like what we might call a dominant response to gender-based violence, by looking towards the criminal justice system as the answer, and that we have, as we know, more and more 500% increase in rates of incarceration in the United States. And I just look at the next slide here to also emphasize that that's not only men in prison, but that is also women and gender nonconforming people, transgender people in prisons as well, at rates that are slightly dipping now, but that have been unprecedented historically, and really unprecedented almost if we look globally. I think that this is not something that you haven't been aware of, and that hasn't been talked about in other presentations, and millions of presentations that you've probably been seeing lately. But I just want to put that front and center in terms of my own work and how I've seen my anti-violence work in the last few years. I also want to share a timeline, and this is, of course, there's so many things on this timeline. It would take me probably an hour and a half just to go through this timeline. In fact, I think I've done that once before. I'm not going to do that now, but it's just a way for us to also be reminded that the development of the anti-violence response, the contemporary anti-violence response in the United States, has a history. This is just a partial or brief history. The focus of this is a little bit more on the anti-domestic violence movement that I've been part of, I think more predominantly for the past 20 years or so. And then on the bottom there, you see more of the history of carceral development in the United States. And I share this for a few reasons. One is that I'm going to show the next slide. So you see here, it starts around 1970, but what I want to do is juxtapose it to another image, which many of you at this point will recognize as US rates of incarceration. So what I really didn't realize when I was so upset in 1994, but more so when I had a chance to go back and do more studies and research into various topics, but one that I wanted to explore more was the development of the anti-violence movement and how we got to be where we are. Um, and what we can see here is if we look here at 1973, what people call the punitive turn, we have US rates of incarceration that if this timeline went all the way back to the 1920s, when this data was first collected, that we'll see like almost a flat line with little bumps along the way from the 1920s, I think it was 1925, until 1973. And after that, we see this dramatic turn upwards. Again, a fivefold, a 500% increase in rates of incarceration in the United States. And even though right now we see obviously alarming concern about this, that's hard for anybody to miss as of June 2020. But there have been efforts prior to this to try to reverse that trend, and we see a slight tipping of that trend. But when you have rates of incarceration that go up 500%, then a slight tip makes a difference, and we'll see what kind of difference it makes in the next few years, but it does not reverse the trend. So this is something obviously still of great concern, and many of us are involved in efforts, right, since especially with defund the police, to take advantage of opportunities of this political moment. Some opportunities of which are already closing up or have closed. We also see, or at least for me, I didn't realize that if you want to put a history at the more contemporary anti-violence movement, feminist anti-violence movement in the United States, for some people, they time that around 1973 for the anti-domestic violence movement, or 1971 is when we saw the first public speak out on rape. So I found it interesting to see how closely the development of the anti-violence movement is tied to the rise of the carceral state in the United States. So in many ways, it shouldn't be surprising then that the development of our social movement in its contemporary form is very much tied to the development and the reliance, increasing reliance on punishment as a response to all forms of social problems and new social problems that have been created along the way. Not to say that we are to be blamed for this, but we have participated in and contributed to the legitimacy of criminalization as a response to violence. And this is something I'm going to talk a little bit more about as a kind of a historical introduction to the work of transformative justice that I've also been fortunate to be a part of. So there's many things on this timeline, but I just am highlighting in the black lettering that you see now of some of the key points, I think, in the development of transformative justice. You can see Kimberly Crenshaw, as many of you know, coined intersectionality. You know, some of us are like, oh, this is a new concept. This is a concept that she coined back in 1989. And of course, in 1991 was when her very influential article first came out. As somebody that was working in the anti-violence movement at that time, you know, we didn't read any, I didn't. We didn't have access to any academic journals. I wasn't reading anything that was supposed to be literature that was on my movement, but this is one that made the rounds. at least among people of color that were working the movement. Somebody started, it was Letty Wolf, I'll tell you, who's a legal scholar at UC Berkeley, had been also working as an advocate for a long time, and said, hey, everybody, you have to see this. And this was the one article that I know I read at the time that, oh my gosh, this is exactly what's happening. This is completely resonating. And I just, it's one of, I think, the few things that came out in a law journal that made it our way and that made a difference in kind of legitimizing, I think, what we were experiencing as people of color, seeing this movement that so many of us were a part of, really flying in the face of our own experience and our own sense of values and our and the strategies that we wanted to center into our movement. At the time, I was at the starting to build a new Korean anti-violence program called Can Win that's still in Chicago today, and would go on to start another Korean domestic violence program in 2000 in Oakland, California. And while I'm very proud of both of those programs, I'm actually working with Ken Wen right now on transformative justice in these very weeks. I also realized that we were taking what was given to us, which was a template of a white feminist kind of not only sort of values and philosophy and politic, but also how that translated into the way that we were going to do our work, crisis lines, with shelters, with legal advocacy, and so on. And that it was a template that still, I'm sure many of you will agree, is one that we still hold onto today, which is that we create a program in which, yes, survivors are centered, but survivors are also asked to remove themselves from those who are important to them. So that might be obviously the person who harmed them, but also family and friends. And I know that in many ways, people in communities of color, this is not uniformly across the board for all of us, but many of us come from cultures in which embeddedness in our families, caring a lot about our families, sometimes more than ourselves as individuals, is actually a strength. And it was looked upon as a weakness and an impediment to liberation. In some ways, we can say, if you look at a kind of a micro situation, people did have to sometimes make a choice to tear away from family values or what families were telling them to do. This was not the case in every situation that I saw, for sure. There were many families that very much supported people to be safe and to seek their freedom in whatever way that would be. But what we did not have is any kind of developed response for people who wanted to engage in a way that might have worked together with families, and even to work together with somebody who was abusive to them, but somebody that they did not want to leave. And that remains the case today. It's something that we have built into our understanding of what it means to seek safety. It's built into our program structures. It's so built in that many of us to this day are having a hard time extricating ourselves from that kind of, I'm going to say at this point, an entrapment of politics and a program design and delivery system that makes it really hard to do alternatives. So I'm going to just sort of like, that's a little, what do you suppose? Well, anyways, I'm going to be coming back to that later as I talk a little bit more about what we developed at Creative Interventions as a different kind of strategy. VAWA, you see VAWA in 1994, but the Insight is an organization that I've been a co-founder of, but it's been very, very important, not only I think to my own personal political development and ability to really be with a collective of feminists of color who had a very similar set of political beliefs that really were in opposition to what we saw happening in most of the mainstream anti-violence movement. We were seeking different sets of responses because many of us, at least at the beginning, had been part of programs, or we had, like in my situation, started programs that in so many ways mimicked, as I said, the kinds of assumptions that have been developed in the United States, and assumptions that were ones that we didn't necessarily hold. We were able to actually center what we thought our assumptions were about violence and about what liberation looked like. And one of the things central to our beliefs was that the system of policing, the criminal legal system, was also a primary purveyor of violence in our lives, in our everyday lives, in our historical trajectory of me as being from Korea. And if I look at the history of US military presence in Korea and the way that that has shaped the development of the country that my parents ended up having to flee for economic reasons, but also for political reasons. My father's a refugee from North Korea. So it's very much something that we as immigrants are kind of asked to forget about in our, how did we get here? Oh, we're seeking a better life. Why did we need to seek a better life? Because for some of us, our countries had been destroyed. So that's something that I also almost have to remind myself of, because it's something in the everyday life of living in the United States that we're asked to forget. That's so much part of our culture of forgetting our past. Generation 5 was another very important organization that worked closely with that really didn't coin the term transformative justice, but that really put that, I think, brought that to life in the United States. At that time, we at Insight tended to use the term community accountability, not as something that was opposed to the term transformative justice, but one that really centered the word community for once. And I think there was also a reluctance to use, for some of us, or like I'll speak for myself, to use the word justice because it had been so occupied by our notion of criminal legal system that I just didn't think it necessarily served the work I was doing. And yet I think at this point, we're in a different era, and that it's really captured people's imaginations. So it's something that I didn't reject at the time, but I tended to use community-based responses to violence, tend to use community accountability, and also was really interested, at least for myself, in the pragmatics of what does this look like on the ground. 2004 was when I started creative interventions with other people in the Bay Area, and you saw other organizations starting, like Philly Stands Up. And if you look up Philly Stands Up, you will see a lot of different materials and zines that they've developed in Philadelphia as part of punk anarchist movement. Never took any kind of nonprofit form, and have done incredible work, some of which is captured in some readings at this point, but also is captured in a lot of the materials that they've continued to keep, even though they're not together as an organization anymore. Audre Lorde Project in 2006 in New York is a queer, transgender, gender nonconforming people of color organization that still exists today, and that started Safe Outside of the System, which was community organizing to really organize the business community, the everyday people in Brooklyn and other parts of New York to form alternative safety strategies for violence against queer and transgender people. Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, you'll see that started in 2011, and they've very much popularized pods, which a lot of people know about pods, pod mapping. Sadly, of course, it's been taken over by some people who are using pods for their elite educational strategies for their children. But I think is a concept that's been really useful to people. So look that up. Project NIA is the organization started by Mariam Kaba in Chicago and is putting out enormous quantities of work. You see the Trayvon Martin, but also Marissa Alexander in 2012 being very monumental moments in our nation's history, and that catapulted the Black Lives Matter movement in 2012. Survived and Punished is another organization that's really been very central to the development of anti-carceral and abolitionist politics, feminist politics, and you'll see a lot of their work in nationally and then in chapters that they have that are looking at the criminalization of survivors of violence. And we go on. So I spent more time on that timeline than I thought I was going to, but it kind of becomes also a way to look at your own history to see where it is that your own work stands, or where your community, what are your community's kind of turning points in and how does that relate to other things that have been happening, both in terms of the development of policy, but also protest and the development of new kind of organizational strategies along that way. I looked at that and I had some time to actually do some of my own research. So I was really interested in, I was already had a very strong critique of the anti-violence movement. And again, a movement I still stand as part of. But I also was really interested in how did this come about? As I said, I started in the late 80s and already it was a bit of a done deal. But the movement started earlier than that. And what I understood was a lot of the early leaders were actually considered themselves like anti-military, anti-police, had come out of radical feminist social movements. Were part of the civil rights movement, but were also part of more radical wings of racial justice movement, and were part of the welfare rights movements and so on. And how is it that this movement had come from a strong radical roots, but had decided that the right move was to embrace law enforcement? In some ways, it didn't make a lot of sense. It makes, it just seems common sense now, like, well, of course that happened. But if you really think about it historically, it just didn't come out of nowhere. And I didn't also believe that it was just like, oh, the cops just took us over. I mean, it's not that simple of a story. And so I was really curious to make my own sense of that story. And what I was reading offered a lot, but I had a lot of unanswered questions. So one of the questions was, how is it this kind of emancipatory, right? Feminism, liberation, chose criminalization as a dominant strategy. How did that make sense? And the second question I had was also understanding that for early in the movement, I mean, remember we came out of the 1970s when, at least for domestic violence, police didn't even consider that a crime. Right? I mean, in some ways they didn't care. They could be like, we don't need you to be part of our system. Stay where, you stay in your domestic sphere and just let us do the serious work, right? They didn't, in some ways, as you know, many still do not. So how is it that seeing that many of the sort of the earlier attempts by some of these feminist leaders to get law enforcement to pay attention or to pass laws was considered a victory? Like, yeah, we won, right? This is a protest movement and we won. And yet I knew that by the time, it was certainly by 2000 and the 2000s, we didn't necessarily feel like the Office of Violence Against Women were something like our proud achievement. In fact, they were the ones that were telling us what to do, were telling us whether or not we were going to get a grant or not, were telling us how we were going to behave or not in in our projects, we were subordinated to them, but we did not feel like the victors. And I don't think there's anybody who felt that they were at that point. So how did this happen? So I just want to I'm going to try to go through this a little bit quickly, but I looked in a lot of doing a lot of interviews and looking at just boxes, tons of boxes of archival materials. Sort of started looking at a couple of programs that came into play that were early, what we call innovations in the anti-violence movement, both starting in 1980. And for those of you who are part of this movement, these victim witness programs are very familiar things that we have now. And then the other is the community coordinated response, or the CCR. So depending on who you are in the audience, some of you may like, I don't know what that is. Other of you are very familiar with them, but I'll just say that both of them started around 1980, the same time. One, a set of strategies that started in California, and this happened to be centered in San Francisco, the Victim Witness Program. The first Victim Witness Program that was focused in on domestic violence was this kind of pilot project that they started in 1980 in San Francisco, where a lot of feminist leaders decided that they were going to try to promote a strategy in which they were actually going to fight for a response to survivors of violence that would be situated right within the Hall of Justice. And then the CCR, Ellen Pence in Duluth, Minnesota, really wanted to start a national pilot of a program that would really, from a feminist position, get law enforcement, local law enforcement, to actually start having an agenda that aligned with the anti-violence movement, and to link together the strategies of advocates together with law enforcement, police, prosecutors, judges, and saw Duluth as a place where there was some possibility for that to happen, and also that there was not opposition from local advocates for somebody coming from St. Paul to come into Duluth and start that kind of program, the CCR. They're now very much part of the anti-violence landscape. So we have what I called the victim witness program. How were advocates situated vis-a-vis law enforcement? We're really embedded within a program. And we think of embedded saying that they had their own kind of autonomous feminist agenda, but we're taking that agenda within law enforcement, the walls of law enforcement itself. And whereas the CCR was more of a coordination of that response. I looked at, in listening to people talk about what they were trying to do at that time, I was really hearing those words of, I mean, literally heard the words of infiltration from the people that had started the victim witness program, that they felt like not only embedded, but they were actually infiltrating. That was a subversive kind of feminist tactic to try to get inside of law enforcement, and also had a lot of pressure from the outside for law enforcement to try to get them to support survivors of domestic violence. And with the CCR, there was another strategy. It was like, I'm calling it feminist oversight, where I think there was a keen understanding that if you would just have advocates together with law enforcement and you put them in a meeting together, you're basically in a systemic relationship where law enforcement's going to win. That advocates are always going to be at a disadvantage. And so one of the things that Ellen thought about is we have to have an oversight organizational structure in which we are actually setting and coordinating this kind of way in which local advocates and law enforcement are going to relate to each other. So we're going to have an enforcement strategy. It's kind of oversight, right? We're going to have some control over how these meetings happen, what the kind of projects that we're going to put forward. And so that there's always going to be kind of a feminist kind of direction to something that otherwise left on its own would be really, really vulnerable to the immediate, if not immediate, then eventual takeover by law enforcement. So we see these projects become, and they both of them develop them to be kind of a national models. I think Duluth was a little bit more maybe of a Minnesota model, but it captured the attention of the country right away. I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but there was a pretty quickly a move to think, oh, these are really interesting projects. We need to replicate them. I think what happens is, do they replicate them with a subversive feminist oversight model? Do they replicate them saying, oh, we knew we were infiltrating? No, when you have the manual, those things do not show up, right? So there's something that happens in the replication of a model in which you, at least in this case, very easily lost the kind of subversive control that feminists had over that particular local formation. And so if we look at this as structurally, if we look at them as a relationship between civil society being outside of government, but being the place and the space and the energy of a social movement versus a state, the state is a target. These two spheres are, I mean, as much as they can be autonomous in the United States, they have some autonomy. You have an embedded system on the left where you could sort of see social movements embedding within law enforcement. You have another kind of system of coordination, if you look to the right, with the CCR. And what you have is, once these kinds of relationships started, that you find yourself losing your sense of your autonomy. That over time, that you find that that you're blended in. A victim witness movement might actually hire people originally from the social movement that were going to be placed within a victim witness program, but still would be hired by an outside social movement organization, you could say. You started getting relationships where it was the district attorney that was hiring the people working in victim witness. You started getting confusion about, well, I have such a good relationship with law enforcement that, am I really still outside in the social movement, autonomous, or am I blending in with law enforcement? And you could see how these institutional structures quickly, as soon as you formed your collaboration, you lost your autonomy. And you started seeing that these spaces really created new kinds of organizational forms that were hybrids between civil society and the state. Same happening with CCRs, and you saw all kinds of different formations of CCRs, some of which were heavily led by law enforcement, and as you still see now. So the question is this: why did an emancipatory feminist movement so strongly pursue criminalization? One of the answers that I found was that they weren't really trying to collude, at least not at the beginning. But actually, they really, like, these leaders still that felt like that they had control over the system. They can continue having this control. And then how did this movement's success lead to the eventual subordination to the same system? And if you want to see this in these little iconic forms, first you have contestation, where you did have protests by social movements against law enforcement that really was blaming victims, doing nothing, very much denying or minimizing the seriousness of domestic violence, to these kind of collaborative forms. And you see the little woman sign here and indicating some form of oversight or of subversive control by feminists in some of these formations. That gets lost, and that gets lost certainly with replication, and that you have replicated programs. I had no inkling or even thought that that's even was part of the strategy, or may have thought that the program itself was part of the strategy. So you see these collaborations replicating across the country. You see these collaborations kind of replicating a hybridized form of feminist cops. We don't know which one we are. I'm sure people out there might feel the same way. That increasingly occupy our social movement, one that had years previously been made up mostly of very autonomous local formations, and that were eventually subordinated by law enforcement. So I just said if this could be seen as a dance, we might call this the carceral creep, and the many, many connotations of that word. So the implications are many, but I just want to highlight these, that this helped to legitimize criminalization as a social solution for social problems. And I don't think that I need to say, but how much is it then that was used as a model for dealing with many of our social problems, including forms of violence, such as homophobic and other hate crimes. I think that it very much inhibited feminist opposition to the growth of the carceral state. If you are constantly going to legislators and saying, we have to enhance criminalization, we need mandatory minimums, we need to encourage arrest or have mandatory arrest, then it's really hard to say, oh, we're against actual criminalization, right? And I think this led to what I saw and have witnessed as like an incredible silence among feminists who I knew as people that very much believe in social justice, to actually have even the ability to articulate or counter strategies that they've actually been championing for so many years. And then a third implication among many is that it crowded out our ability to have any kind of alternative strategies. And it still does today. So what is the resolution to this crisis? Dismantle our reliance on criminalization. And we have a lot of different coalitions now, domestic violence, sexual assault coalitions, that really for the past few years have been thinking about how to do this. There's been an increasing recognition of the over-reliance on and contributions to the carceral state that I think are very much the result of the ongoing, persistent, and undying work of largely of women of color that have been within the movement and us at the peripheries of the movement, a lot of which has been influenced by the work of Insight for the past 20 years, like unrelenting in our demands for this to happen. And that we have to build community response at all levels. So this moves me into for this next phase of thinking about building alternatives. And I just want to say that I'm here talking to you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about creative interventions, but there have been so many different organization formations, some of which are still existing today, some of which are not, but they have been really engaged in this, in the struggle, in the politics, and in the practices of trying to find a way to look at gender-based violence and interpersonal violence that does not rely upon the violence of the state. A little bit about restorative justice and transformative justice. I know that's what you all have been talking about. And this is a very sort of, crude, kind of simplistic visual here. So just, and this is very much flattening so much rich work that has been done, but just for the sake of some kind of analysis of this, if we look at law enforcement, kind of reliance on law enforcement on the left and community alternatives on the right, restorative justice certainly has just very rich work, a huge trajectory of work. I was just this morning in a workshop with Indigenous people from the Yukon who started a lot of this work in Canada just because that's what they've been doing as a people, and was really honored to be part of that and bringing that spirit here with me today. that is, I don't necessarily call it restorative justice, right? So there's a lot of indigenous practice not called restorative justice at all. I would say that with the work of transformative justice does have a different political trajectory that some of us, some different practitioners have come from kind of more of a recognized restorative justice teachings. Some of us were just thinking, what is it that we're trying to do that's alternative? What would liberation look like in the future, but also in our programs? And I know that for my own work, I knew there was other work happening in the restorative justice world. I knew there was indigenous roots to that work. And some of this was just, what could this look like? And I'll get into that in a minute. Similar in so many ways, right? Turning away from punitive systems, turning towards collective responses and community participation, really recognizing violence is not just an individual act, right? But one that takes place within a community setting, one in which the community and a collective response to that is the correct response, that elevates the voice and experience of survivors and victims, the support, thinks about support for people who have done harm to change within a connected and community context. These are things that we have in common, sometimes from a different political trajectory, sometimes because of the common work that we've done. But what are some differences? And these are not always differences. I know there's a lot of people that do transformative justice work that really interchangeably say restorative justice and transformative justice. But as you know from the examples you've been given, that restorative justice in its development, at least in many countries across the globe, but in the United States, tends to be linked to criminal justice, and that it's seen as a diversion or a reform within that system. So you have so many restorative justice programs, and I know you heard from some of them, that are very much tied to law enforcement. Transformative justice is not tied to law enforcement. And if people say transformative justice and it's tied, then it's really not transformative justice. I'm one that I'm not dogmatic about language at all. I'm very, very flexible and open about that. But this is one way in which I am not. I think there are many ways that people practice transformative justice, yes. But transformative justice is not part of the system. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that might mean in practice, but certainly I've had people say, oh, I want to use transformative justice because I really like that word. I'm like, no, please do not use that. And in fact, one of the projects that Aparna talked about that I'm doing right now, I do not call transformative justice because it is not, because it's not based in law enforcement actually, but it's based in organizations that don't consider themselves transformative justice. So there's a place for that, but I think we have to be very clear and transparent about the boundaries of that kind of work and what that means. There is a way, and some practitioners of restorative justice have talked about this as sort of restoring something that we started with as a whole. I think a lot of people practicing transformative justice see that what we start with is a lot of systems of harm and oppression that many of us come from everyday lives in which violence is everyday and is also tied to systems of oppression, which is systems of poverty, of capitalism, of racism, of sexism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-immigrant sentiments, and ableism, and so on. And that I think that there are many people in the restorative justice community that believe these similar things, but I think that these are something that are deeply held by, I'd say, everybody that I know that has been practicing transformative justice for a while. So there's the idea that we're not necessarily restoring something that has been harmful, but that we're transforming and we're moving towards conditions of liberation. So those are some of the differences. We have the mainstream domestic violence, sexual assault movement that generally has stayed pretty much outside of restorative justice or transformative justice. we have a little bit of inching forward. Just want to point out some examples that we have in which you could say that they're part of kind of an intersection. Hollow water, which is an example that's used a lot, that's in First Nations community in Canada. There's, I know, a documentary that's been out there a lot of people have seen, but it is tied to a tribal law enforcement system. So I do want to say that. Circles of Peace in Nogales, which was started by a judge who was very tired of seeing recidivism, the same people coming through, and so has embraced a kind of a restorative justice program. San Francisco Sheriff's Resolve to Stop the Violence calls itself a restorative justice program, and it very much works with people that are already incarcerated. So I'm not saying these as a criticism of these particular programs, but I am saying that we have to be, again, really knowledgeable and transparent about what their relationship was with law enforcement. So if people just put these into one bucket as if they're the same thing, they are not. And so when we're going to choose our particular strategy that we call transformative justice or restorative justice, that we really need to be very mindful of what it is that we are embracing as some of the fundamental relationships we have to law enforcement and the assumptions that we have in our programs. Transformative justice, hey, our answers, and that could be anybody watching this. There's a way in which we have lineages that were very harmful to vulnerable people. So I'm not going to romanticize and say we all have pre-colonial, everything was beautiful. Some of us will never know. But that we also, many of us do come from lineages in which there was a collective response to violence that we can learn from, and it was very positive. And so transformative justice is like new language, but it's certainly not a new concept. And I think the same thing could be said for restorative justice, that very much sees itself in these lineages from Indigenous past. Insight, I again want to lift up Insight Generation 5. Philly Stands Up, again, starting in 2004 in Philadelphia. Support New York has been another program that's not been tied to any kind of a nonprofit, but that was doing autonomous work with people who've done harm in New York, and a little bit more recently put out some of their processes in a kind of toolkit form. Project NIA, again, Mariam Kaba's organization, Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, BATJC, and just started by Mia Mingus. And probably a lot of you are now familiar with her work. And the work of PODS is very much coming out of BATJC. Creative Interventions is another, and there is a list, and you could see that other page where I had a lot of organizations listed. So those are in the transformative justice tradition, and a lot of us have done our work together. Like, we found out about each other, we went to the same Insight conference, we found many of us did our work unfunded or very underfunded, so we're very creative about how we tried to share our work and share space over the years, and still have formed a really, I think, a pretty beautiful community of solidarity among us. And put this as a little bit of a different thing. Can we say that I know many of us that are within a more formal anti-violence programs are thinking about what do alternatives look like within organizational setting. And this is something that we're still like developing and struggling with. And I just want to point out a couple programs, and one is API Chaya in Seattle that works with Asian Pacific Islander people, and that had a lot of people that have been part of their volunteers and their staff that were also part of the transformative justice work outside of the organizational setting, and had been doing that in their own communities, kind of like after work hours. And they have, in the last couple of years, really decided that they were going to do an experiment to see what it looks like to offer transformative justice support in relation to sexual violence if people wanted that, and kind of peeled off. I think that's I'm saying peeled off. I don't know if they call it that way, but they haven't dismantled every aspect of their program. What they've said is that we were going to do something that looks at how we are going to also have part of our service model to provide transformative justice. What does that look like? And have had mentorship and training from different people that have been part of the transformative justice community in the Pacific Northwest. I know Shir Hassan is one of the people that's been working with them a lot, and others. And then a program that I'm only starting to talk about right now, which is called the Contra Costa County Community Restorative Justice Solutions, another pilot project, and at the same timing as SCRJI. And we are working together also with Sujata Balaga, who you already heard from, and are really trying to apply this kind of the circle model that's been a little bit more developed to situations of sexual and domestic violence in Contra Costa County. And we have a collaboration of 9 different organizations that are, it's been really exciting and hard work to train up people to be circle keepers, to figure out what that really looks like with sexual and domestic violence, to figure out how we're going to refer people to that particular project and so on. So what we want to do by the end of that is to share what we've learned with all of you, but we're still in the learning stages. So we're a little hesitant to talk about it a lot, but I can answer some questions if you have them today. I think there is a way in which we're trying to move in this direction. And I also wanted to say a little bit just for some of you, that some of this comes from, a more kind of overt political space. For some of it just comes looking at what have our survivors asked for? What if survivors wanted? Have they wanted to escape to shelter? Hey, please, call 911. I want the abuser arrested. I want to leave the relationship. Well, some people, yes. But is that most of the people that we hear from? Even though those are the options that we have available, how many people do we know have wanted to stay safe at home, have wanted the violence to stop, but not necessarily to leave that relationship, or that they have to coexist in some relationship because of shared children and so on? How many have wanted to keep homes and community intact? And I just ask ourselves this question of, if we look at the past 40 years, I mean, we don't have like an A+ for sure in the options that we have available. But when we look at what we have available in terms of somebody staying safe at home, stopping the violence, but staying in a relationship, keeping homes and communities intact, we have done very poorly. And in fact, people still say, what? I don't know, or that's too dangerous, or we just have so many questions in this area. Despite 40 years of the development of all of our resources, they've all moved in one direction, and they've been constrained by what I said, that carceral creep, right? By our ties to the logic of law enforcement, to the idea that it's the only way to create safety is through separation, from a real terror even of like thinking about how is it that we would actually work in that murky gray area, and yes, sometimes dangerous area, that very area that survivors live in day to day, that some of us are not even willing to engage in, instead saying, oh, come over to our safe space in our safe way, where you are the individual autonomous survivor and your children. And yes, we know you love your family and so on, but we don't actually have anything to deal with. We don't have a lot of strategies to deal with them. And, oh, you want them to come to our office? No, right? You might think, oh, no, I remember having, and I've had people say this, no, I had a situation where I remember somebody brought their mom. I'm like, well, you can think of a handful of situations. It does not mean that that's what we regularly do in our programs. Okay, there might be some that have, but I know that there's like there's very much in the minority. So what do we want? And my question then is, what's stopping us from doing that? Again, I want to turn to all of these people that have been part of building alternatives, and I know that includes some of you in South Carolina. If I don't know you right now, includes Aparna. I know that. That some people are looking at this as community accountability, transformative justice, or just, another way of doing things. I just want to give, now I do have to look at the time because I know when, am I doing okay, Aparna?
Yeah, we might want to
Start wrapping up.
for questions. Yeah. So, but this
Yeah,
is,
okay. I think I'm moving towards the end and we'll stop going on at length at some of these slides.
yeah.
So what is transformative justice? We can say it's a framework, a politic. For some people, it's a way of life for building this world of liberation. So it's not just like a method and approach, but for many people, it's much larger than that. But it is also a way or method of dealing with conflict, violence, harm, and abuse without creating more harm. And creating more harm for many means engaging in law enforcement and using the violence of law enforcement system in order to deal with harm. Understanding violence is rooted in a greater system of inequality and conditions of oppression. And this thought that we could use collective care, compassion, and connection, and not just the threat of punishment or the actual use of violence and force to create change. It tends to be collective and community based. We use processes that mobilize friends, family, and community. We really believe in the possibility of transformation for everybody and anyone impacted by violence, including people who have done harm. That does not mean that we are always able to get there. But if we do not have that as a trajectory of possible change, and we see that that is possible, and we're always going to think, no, there's always manipulation, that's not possible, which is a lot of the way that we have learned to operate, then we are never going to reach transformation. It tends, I think that transformative justice tends to be non-professionalized, carried out by community members, and some of us consider this our political work. And again, I want to say it's never with law enforcement. I just want to share some images here that come out of some people doing transformative justice work in Chicago, and put up a bunch of posters in schools, which is really beautiful, just to show, be a model for young people to start thinking about how they use transformative justice. And again, I know this is a lot of the work that people who say they're doing restorative justice work do. And here's another one. And I'm going to end with a little bit more about creative interventions. That in 2004, we started our organization. This is some of the imagery that we use, making ending violence an everyday act. So this was the idea of like, this is not really about building up programs. This is about building up capacity and skills within all of us in the community to actually know understand what it is, what violence looks like, but also being able to interrupt violence when it starts. What we hope to do was to move from the kind of options, and again, I've worked many years in the anti-violence movement and worked 10 years at a shelter. So how is it that we move from towards some of these other options that we as a movement have not done well? We looked at a program, and we had some basic and fundamental ways we wanted to do the work. And I'll start here: collective and coordinated. That we had open-ended questions. Like, we didn't ask, well, many of you might ask, well, what do you want? But if somebody says what they want, we go, well, what we have is a shelter, a restraining order, connections to lawyers, civil and criminal. How about that, right? So this was very open-ended, really, really deeply listening to what people said they wanted, and giving them the space to even say what they wanted, because a lot of people don't know in the midst of crisis and when everybody's telling them what to do. Something that was holistic, which we meant looking at the interests and the safety and the health of everybody involved in violence. That's the survivor, of course, but also looking at that for the community and for thinking about safety and health for the person who has done harm, which is certainly something that was a transformation for me to think about. That we might engage the person who's done harm, that we think about risk taking. There's a way in which we doing anti-violence work are so narrowly defining safety that we define it as not doing anything that might be harmful, and in which and defining safety as being completely physically separated from that person who's done harm, even if they want other options that might reduce their harm but stay in relationship in some way. We don't go there for a large part. That sometimes creating long-term safety means taking risks, and that they're based in the community. We did have a facilitated model, but we saw ourselves as facilitators only, that we were not providing the answers, but what we were doing was providing space, a forum to ask questions, stories from other people who have done interventions. We offer knowledge and resources, but we didn't offer the answers. Again, we didn't narrowly say, well, you can do X, Y, and Z, but we really said, what is it that you want? And let's think more about who could help you with that. Not, I'm going to help you with that, but who do you have in your social network that could actually create that for you? How is it that you can coordinate that response so that works for you? And that we worked with anybody. We had chairs set up. I think we had like a lot of chairs. We had a big room that was a lot of chairs in a circle, and from the beginning, from the first day, and asked people who they wanted to come in with. So those are just some things that we did, and I can answer some more questions as we go along. These are some of the components of the model. I do want to say that, just take that in for a minute. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but what we found is there were some common things that were, they might be overlapping, but might be, you might think of them as phases in a kind of a coordinated response to violence. And we really wanted to, from our years of doing the project, we wanted to come up with, and I'll show you, this tool. Okay, yes, we put everything we knew in a toolkit, which just became available in paperback form because we had it on a PDF download. I found out that my friend spent $80 at Staples printing it. I was horrified. And so we just worked to make this available online. And you could go to our website to find where to find that. It's many sites online to say that. We collected stories of people that have done responses to violence just among themselves in all kinds of creative ways. And we work collectively to shift the movement. And then what does that mean? Is that a project? Is that, hello, if you're watching this, that's what we're doing right now. That's the toolkit. Again, it's available in free PDF online. It's now available in Spanish. The collective in Spain said, do you want this in Spanish? I said, okay, and they did that. And I just got another person from Quebec that said, do you want this in French? So apparently that's going to be happening too. And a Maori community that put this in an interactive form. This is another great resource that some of you might already know about. I know it's here near me, but Fumbling Towards Repair. It's another book, particularly for people that have been, it's not like an intro to transformative justice. It's more of for people that are facilitating multiple types of interventions. It's a great resource, a great book. There's now a mixtape series that's on various aspects of transformative justice that got put up by Just Practice. So if you look up Just Practice mixtape, this will come up, and that's available to you. I think they're asking for some money for that, but it's got some really, really great basic information. And there's transformharm.org, which is, again, Mariam Kaba is like the great archivist and producer of knowledge, unsurpassed, I really think. And it's true. Miriam does not sleep. So transformharm.org has all kinds of toolkits of all sorts available for you, and they're all available for free. So we now have, when I started this, we had 0 toolkits, and now there's tons of them. So, hey, there's no excuse, right, for not doing the work. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for listening to that. I hope it made some sense for you and that it met some of your needs out there in the audience. I can't see your faces, so cannot tell, but I hope that to be true. Aparna.
Yeah, I think that was great. Thank you so much. And I also really appreciate it. I have to say that you had those overlapping circles, because I do feel like I put myself in the restorative justice bucket, but I definitely, engage in a lot of programming that doesn't actually involve the criminal justice system.
Right.
But I see the difference as well from the transformative justice approach, which is, as you and I discussed at a different time, is like a little bit more fluid, certainly.
Yes.
So I want to actually, there are a number of questions, and I want to at least get to some of them. So there was an early question about asking you to talk more about the window closing, the window of this political moment. And then there's another related one that I'm just going to read, because I think you can answer them at once.
Okay.
I wonder if you can say something about the politics that face coalitions and programs that are trying to pivot and the backlash they sometimes face. I am thinking of the Wisconsin program that lost county funds because they had a Black Lives Matter sign, or the coalitions that lost state legislator funding when they no longer supported criminalization.
Yeah. I'm first going to address, they are 2 different questions, but they're related, of course. I think in terms of this opportunity, or this what's the portal, or people are calling it different things. I think this is always true when there's a time of massive change. We've all gone through this, right? In June, well, we've gone through many things. We're still going through many things. It's really kind of impossible to be a human being and sort of take it all in. But I think with the defund the police demands that happened in so many different cities, that one way I saw that as happening is suddenly you actually had city councils saying, okay, we're going to defund the police, or we'll take significant money out of police budgets, something we never do, and we are going to place them in alternatives. And there's been all kinds of ideas about what those should be. Oh, social workers should accompany police. Like, no, I'm actually teaching social work. I'm like, no, no. I think social workers need to understand what the relationship has been to law enforcement, similarly to what I was talking about in terms of the anti-violence movement, and some of whom are the same people. But I could see that, and it's happening already, things that were pronounced as like, oh, there's going to be this big change, then all the mechanics of law enforcement, the powers that be, have been maneuvering ways to make reverses. So it's been, you have this like incredible optimism, at the same time like fear, anxiety, at the same time really seeing some of these things close up. There was a way in which like, oh, if they close up, they'll never open again. Mm-hmm. Or is it, we certainly, if nothing else, we have to learn from the ways in which opportunities come up and the ways in which we lose them, and really move towards being much more strategic. And I think I am having these conversations. Maybe, sometimes it feels a little bit late, as so many of us were being caught up in, I think, doing our own local maneuvers to try to, keep that space open, or make a space. And some of the, I know for myself, some of the challenge was that I have so long worked outside of systems that you're suddenly having to sort of engage with systems to figure out what that looks like. Like, oh, you're going to move mental health from crisis response with the law enforcement to the Department of Health or public health, but is that any better?
Mhm.
Who's there? I haven't engaged with people there. What does that look like? Um, do we how much do we make sure that we have a strategy that also funds things that are completely outside of those systems, and is that going to go anywhere? um, for those of us in transformative justice, I think we've just been continuing our work. No money, sometimes we get money, we're still doing it that way. So much of it is done with no money at all, but also that means there's a limited number of people doing the work. So I think that portal closing, it is happening. It's happening. Is it completely closing up? I think what we have to do is really start gathering information about where have we been able to make some significant, not only reforms, but changes that actually expand the possibility of reduce the actual engagement and involvement with law enforcement,
Mhm.
and expand the possibilities for a community-based capacity building. So uh, I'm really, really curious about that. I've been having my own private conversations with people about that, including you, Parna. And I think that we have to be really smart and strategic as we move forward. About coalitions, I don't work, I mean, I work somewhat with the coalitions that are in California, so that's where I've been living. Um, and yes, that Wisconsin situation, I'm sure that's not the only one. It's the one that's come out in the press. Um, I think that there are people in other states that are facing some really serious backlash, not only from legislators and from law enforcement, but also from, right wing, uh, alt right kind of movement people, some of whom, are physically dangerous. So this is another thing, is that because we've become such a social service kind of organizational structure, that we don't know how to deal with risk and violence. We've all of risk and violence we've kind of thrown towards the law enforcement. You take care of it. We don't do that. Whereas we started as a movement that did deal with that. We had strategies. We knew how to deal with not only individual level violence, but we knew how to deal with collective and community based violence. And uh, not only resistance from the patriarchy in our local communities, but the actual, in some ways, the armed resistance of that community. So we've lost our capacity to do that, and I don't know. It's hard sometimes to see how we're going to regain that when it's been so many decades of moving in a kind of very professionalized service direction, where you hire people that fit that kind of mold, and those people that are like more community or organizing minded actually end up leaving service organizations time and time again because they don't fit in. There's not support for them. They're the one person, this is true also for people that are hired as that person of color, is they just leave because the overall structure doesn't support them. So having faced this same systemic problem for so many years, and kind of during those trainings, that didn't necessarily help. I think that, or didn't help enough. I have a big question about that. What I think it is, it's up to coalition people to really get together and strategize. I know people like Nan Stoops, has been uh, very, I think, really, really committing a lot of time, energy, and strategic thinking around how to work with coalitions, understanding coalitions quite well, in what does that pivot look like and how can that be done in a significant way. And I haven't talked to Nan since the more recent news about Wisconsin and so on, but I have been working with Nan for quite a while, and knew that they were coming out with that letter, the moment, what's called Moment of Truth. Um, that might have set off some of this backlash as well. I know I don't have a good answer for that, but I also don't think that I'm going to be the person that's going to come up with the answer for that, given that I'm not central to the coalition world. Doesn't mean I don't care about that. I think it's really important. Um, But I do think that coalitions are going to have to organize themselves in a way that they haven't before. And yeah.
Thank you. So I think we've got just a little bit more time, so I'm going to pair two more questions that I think are related. The first is, how do you conceptualize justice, right, and transformative justice? And the second is, under this transformative justice model, in the absence of a criminal justice system, how do you achieve safety?
How do you choose safety?
How do you achieve safety?
Achieve safety.
Achieve safety, and how is the responsible party held accountable?
How do we achieve safety? I mean, as I said, transformative justice it's a method and approach, but it's really an overarching framework. So if we think of people, some of what transformative justice tells you is you don't leave it to somebody else. It is your responsibility. It's our responsibility. It's our collective responsibility to deal with violence. That we're not going to say, oh, I'm going to call 911. Oh, we're just going to go to that agency. It's what are we going to do as people that are violent, that are survivors of violence, that know people and love people who are survivors and people who are violent, to actually, what would it take to actually stop that? It asks a big question that people are responding to in many different ways. So how is it that you have conversations in your family about violence that has happened historically and violence that might be happening now? How are you going to come up with a strategy to respond? A lot of this is asking questions and expecting the answers not to be in law enforcement, but expecting the answers to be in communities. So a lot of our work is fostering conversations, but it's not only fostering conversations. So the work at Creative Interventions, we asked a lot of questions, but it wasn't just like an exercise in imagination or storytelling. It was an exercise in actually coming up with action plans, but action plans that made sense given the kinds of values that you have in your community. And that could be the community of 5 people that are talking about it. The kind of values you have are the kind of values you can build if you don't have those values in common. It comes up with thinking about who among us can take what kind of role in addressing this problem. It is around how we're going to meet and how we're going to keep coordinated so that we're on point and we're not all doing something that's completely saying something different than somebody else. Who really cares about this person? Who are they going to listen to? How can we engage them and get them involved in the strategy? And it's really building up our ability to have these conversations, to think about our values, and to come up with skills so we're not like, oh, I'm not going to do that. But I'll do that. I could be like, I've got your back. We can do it together. You can talk. I will be talking about safety. Let's figure out how we can be safe so that I'll be standing there in the same room. I just did this the other day. It's like, I'm going to be, basically within a couple minutes from you with our phones, and I will be there in case anything goes wrong. So these are the kinds of, I don't have like a cookie cutter answer. It is really a different orientation for looking at harm and our solutions to harm.
Do you conceptualize the term justice in a particular way?
I was one of those people that just really I adopted transformative justice as a term because it had so much appeal to people and I understood it had meaning. I mean, I know y'all a lot of people, so you can ask. Yeah. I'm sure other people answer that really well. I am not going to be the person to answer that well. I really care much more about what kind of action we're going to take to do things in the right way.
Well, as a law person, I can say I go back and forth on it a lot, and sometimes I'll use the word practice or approach or justice because I don't feel comfortable. If I don't feel comfortable using justice one day, I'll say practice or approach. But
yeah, I understand. You can give me the answer to that one of these days.
Maybe
that makes sense.
Well, I have to thank you so much for joining us, Mimi. I mean, you've been great. I always love listening to what you have to say, and I think we've all learned quite a lot. And in addition to the questions that popped up, or a number of comments, just thanking you and saying they appreciated your words. So I know it's been well received. So to everyone who's joined us, I'm so glad you were able to join us. Next week, we have no webinar in honor of and respect of your right to vote. We will be reconvening the week after on November 10th. So we will see you then.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.